Today would be Barry Farber's 91st birthday, and tomorrow is the first anniversary of his death at 90 years. He had been on the radio, thanks largely in part to the historical respect that Mike Horn has at CRN for the legacies and the history of talk radio. He was on until the day before he died, probably the longest running host on radio in America when he died, and an absolute treasure. Perhaps a couple of minutes between the two of you just talking about what kind of dad he was and what your lives were like growing up having a legendary father who's a broadcasting icon.
Well, I miss him terribly. It's really hard to find words to describe him. You all, everybody here, you knew him. He wasn't two people, one person on the radio and another person off the air. I've been reflecting on, Barry had this core that was not exactly what was the radio version of Barry. And the core is the language, countries, maps, people, all of that. And a lot of that went into the movie. So I've just been reflecting on how there's all this talk now. Our whole nation is gripped by it, about the idea that certain people are racists, and that our nation is such a and that the conservatives and Republicans are this plague. And all my life with my father, I've secretly felt like I don't understand what people mean when they say conservatives are bigoted or xenophobic or racist, because I had this father who we'd send him to the store on Thanksgiving to get, could you get some butter? And he'd come back an hour later. No butter. They didn't have butter. Nobody heard of butter in the store, but he would have spoken. He go, oh, I got to practice, and he'd cite all these West African languages. Those guys stacking the groceries, he would go up to them and just, where are you from? And start speaking their language. And I saw it over and over and over again. It just, their eyes would light up like they became for the first time a human being. Somebody could see them, and somebody could speak to them in their language.
I have one comment from what you said, and that is, they say when you speak the language of a people, you understand their thinking and you understand them better than if it's through a translator. Therefore, Barry probably had this incredible worldview because of his ability to speak so many languages. And that came out in his mastery of foreign affairs. Bibi, pick up for a couple of minutes now. Your thought.
Okay. First of all, I want to tell you that Barry had a childlike wonderment throughout his whole life, and he was, in a sense, like a little 6 or 7-year-old exploring the world. Things like a GPS technology. We'd be driving somewhere, and it would be saying, stay in the left lane, a left exit coming up in a half a mile, and Barry would say, how does she know to stay in the left lane and be in the left? GPS technology he thought was rocket science, and so many, but he loved people. He loved people. He wanted us to always be expanding, us, his children, but his audience. He made cassettes with the 25 super words, and he sold them to his audience for $10. These 25 words will set you apart from everyone else. And he had of course, language books, best-selling language book on how to learn any language, but he just wanted us to always be exploring, reaching, even if we only spoke English, speak better English. He wrote this book, How to Not Make the Same Mistake Once, about etiquette and being gracious and not bugging people. And he even had his own Barryism for that. It was called Annoy Not. He wanted people to learn the art of annoy not. And I also want to say one of his famous sign-offs was keep asking questions. And in today's major media, it's the exact opposite. Don't you dare ask any questions. But Barry was always imploring us to learn more, reach higher, penetrate the ostensible, don't believe everything you hear, and get to the heart of things and the root of things. And keep asking questions.
To be continued, which was his other closing line, which I find is one of the most convenient ways to get out of almost every conversation when they're running too long. You know, I always have, as Barry Farber would say, to be continued. Let's go. Thank you, Bibi. And thank you, Bibi and Celia. Jeremy Bannister is the grandson of Barry Farber. And one of the things that I found remarkable when we actually had a bit of a technical rehearsal, which went very smoothly, by the way. Jeremy sounds like his grandfather. He looks like his grandfather. And as I said before, he has a mastery of technical and abstract reasoning that reminds me of his grandfather. So Jeremy, you're in Spain. You're studying Spanish. You look like you're in some kind of a dark cave. It's very mysterious looking. Tell us about what it's like to be the grandson of Barry Farber.
Hi, Michael. Thank you for introducing me like that. I'm Jeremy. I'm Barry's grandson, and since we're short on time, I'll condense what I was going to say a bit. So, okay, what was it like to be Barry's grandson? Well, he was impressive and entertaining. Of course, I mean, those words, nobody would deny that those described him very well. And so, when thinking about what I wanted to say, I thought about is there something I can do for Barry with these words right now? And does he need something? And of course, one perspective on that would be that you wouldn't be likely to find an answer to that because he's passed. So what could he need? What could I do for him? But this is for him, and here we are for him. So I pondered it nonetheless. And I considered the perspective that maybe each of us contains a bit of every person we've interacted with. And so this gathering of people who are Barry's people contains a lot of Barry. And so in that sense, like, we all are Barry. And therefore I am speaking to Barry to a certain sense, so that gets me halfway to solving the question of, is there something I can do for him with my words? Because let's say I'm speaking to him in all of you right now. And then secondly, well, what words could I say that would help him? And so we know he did the things he did and how amazing he was, and we'll talk all about that. But so I thought I would use my few minutes to just say that on the personal side of things, I think it takes a toll to be that impressive and entertaining. Or maybe I could describe it as that it could be a bit lonely up there on the stage, and that he didn't allow himself to come down from the stage ever, pretty much, in my experience. Although, of course, the majority of his life passed before I was sentient, so I can only speak to what I know. But that the question of how do you feel was not allowed to have much importance. And so the thing I wanted to do was basically just a conversation that I imagine might have happened inside of Barry's head between the two Barrys, or two of the Barrys, the entertaining one and the one that's feeling things. And I feel like sometimes maybe the feeling Barry said in a moment, like, hey, said to the intellectual Barry, could we tell them how we're feeling right now? And that the intellectual Barry perhaps responded sometimes, they don't want to hear about that. I'll tell them about Bulgaria. And so I don't say this to imply that any of us didn't want to hear how he felt. We all wanted to hear. I say this because I think specifically that the same way that my heart responds to that scenario with an empathic grief of like, no, Grandpa, please tell us how you feel. We don't need to be entertained all the time. Like, we want to know about you inside as well. And so the conclusion is to the piece of Barry inside of all of us that may share that fear of opening up and stopping the entertainment for a moment and connecting in a more emotional way. We want to hear what you feel, and you don't need to hide that part of you.
Wow.
So,
Jeremy, you're an amazing young man, and I'm so glad I'm having a chance to know you, and everybody else I think is very touched by what you said. And yeah, it's very important to want to know what a grandfather feels. I think it's an important part of the equation, and I'm so glad that you presented that. Is Jerry Farber here? I assume he is. Jerry Farber is Barry's younger brother, and another person who I've discovered in the process of this organized effort.
Sit next to him.
Jerry is very, very well-known man. And there he is. Okay, he's in Patty's thing. Jerry, it's a pleasure meeting you. You're very impressive. Jerry's a stand-up comedian and a great mover and shaker of the comedy scene in the state of Georgia. And I don't know whether you know it or not, Jerry, but you sound and you look like your brother. So it's sort of like giving us a little bit of a taste of somebody that we all miss very much. Would you speak a little bit now and tell us your feelings?
Sure, Michael, thank you for that. I hope my brother's comfortable with the comparison. I am. He was a strong, I don't know if we realize that I'm the only human that remembers Barry as a kid. We shared a bedroom until he was 16. I was 8 years younger. What I remember, so many stories about Barry, but BB and Celia instructed me 3 minutes at the most. A great story about Barry when the war. Barry was born in 1930. I was born in 38. We used to listen to, we didn't have a television for a long time, but we had radio. People would talk about the Nazis were here, the Allies were here, and all I wanted to do was to go out and play with the dog. But Barry had a great story. He called Greensboro, this is a matter of record. When the Allies won the war in 1945, I was 7 years old. Barry was 15 or 16. He called the school, Greensboro Senior High School, and told him he was from the radio station, WGBG in Greensboro, and said, school is out because the Allies won the war and it's a holiday. This is true. This is documented. So the principal, they called, kids were allowed to go home and celebrate the end of the war. So the principal was A.P. Ruth, R-O-U-T-H. He was my principal 8 years later. And Barry then was traveling as a young journalist, as you know. And he wrote a letter to the principal. I was in the 10th grade. I was 8 years younger. But this is what happened. He called, representing a radio station, said the kids can go home to celebrate the victory of the Allies. So the president ultimately expelled Barry from high school for a day for doing that, impersonating the radio, and let the kids out. Years later, Barry wrote him a letter that was published in all the newspapers in North Carolina. It said, Principal Ruth, thank you for the great education in high school. Appreciate your patience. He said, I am where you always said I would be. I am now in hell, H-E-L-L, Norway. He wrote him a letter from a town. You can Google this if anybody wants to now. There's a town in Norway called Hell. And Barry said, you always said I'd end up here, and that's where I am. And my parents laughed. I always loved to see older people laugh. It made me feel secure. And that was one of many stories of Barry as a really young boy. And I think he would love it because we all talked about Hell, Norway.
Thank you, Jerry. Thank you very much. I want to thank Celia for going to a tremendous amount of effort to record Sarah Pence, Barry's widow, who could not be with us tonight for health reasons. And I understand she made a very touching tribute.
He was the kindest person I have ever met in my life. He would not do anything to make somebody unhappy, knowingly. He may have done something, but he didn't know it.
What would you like to say to the people who have gathered to honor Barry?
Oh, I want to tell them how lucky they are. They are so lucky that they are on this broadcast, listening to all these important people, not me, but the important people like Ted Kavanaugh and so on, who I adore, Ted. But listening to them talk about Barry and listening to the there's another word I would use about Barry. He has a spirit. He has a spirit. He loves this country. He loves this country so much. And he would kill for this country. He would do anything to make this. And he was always upset when somebody would say something not on his show, but in the news, would say something negative about the Bill of Rights or Paul Revere. Oh, yeah. He was a very religious person. But he did not impose his religion on me, which was good because I was not religious. But I respected him, and I kept quiet, or I would leave the room. I wanted him to say his prayers, and he was deeply in another world when he said his prayers.
What would you say to Barry now if he could hear you?
Oh, God. I would tell him 1,000 times how much I love him. And I will never stop loving him. He's so embedded in my personality. Oh, I wish I could say that I loved him every day. I do, but it's not the same because he's not here.
Okay, we are continuing. That was Sarah Pence, for those of you watching on YouTube. I'm Michael Harrison from Talkers. BB and Celia Farber are here, and a whole bunch of friends and associates of Barry Farber, who died at the age of 90. Tomorrow is the anniversary of that, and today is Barry Farber's 91st birthday, and this is an industry tribute to the memory of one of our greatest friends and certainly one of our greatest professionals. Now, at this point in the program, we were going to play an audio-video presentation from Sean Hannity, who thought very highly of Barry.
I also want to just take a moment. Somebody who's very kind to me all throughout my radio career is a guy who passed away, Barry Farber. He spoke like 40,000 languages. He's in heaven now. Now any language in the history of mankind he's speaking, and he learned instantaneously. 90 years old, still doing radio till the day before he passed away. And when you hear me, you hear me quote him. I said, "There's never been a country that has accumulated more power and abused it less than this country." That's Barry Farber's line. I give him attribution every time. I add my little thing, which is no country's accumulated more power and not only abused it less, but used it for the advancement of the human condition than America. He was a patriot. He was one of the great pioneers of talk radio. He took an interest in me when I was in Huntsville, Alabama. And he came in once for the station I was at the time and did an event with us. He let me fill in on his national show. He was just the kindest, nicest guy you'd ever want to meet in radio. And he will be missed. He's got his family surviving him, his daughters and loved ones, and we send our prayers out to them today. But one of the reasons I wanted to do this is him. I listened at night, late night. I remember he'd say, "Go get a map of the world," and I go get my globe. And he'd talk all about the former Soviet Union and history, World War II and expansion and a country called Albania. He often talked about that. And all the languages he spoke. I got an education, but I also got a love of radio. My parents would come in, "Shut that thing off." I'd say, "Okay." Then I'd hear my father. He used to pound the pavement. The whole house shook when he walked. He'd go back in his room, and I'd turn the radio back on. Just a little lower this time. Godspeed. Good and faithful servant, Barry Farber. You'll be missed in more ways than you will know. He made a lot of this happen for me in my life by inspiring me.
Mike Horn is one of the visionaries in the broadcasting industry. He's a great broadcaster, a lover of radio, and a lover of radio's history. And Barry finished up his career doing shows on Mike Horn's CRN Digital Talk Radio Network, which is a marvelous invention and still one of the most influential venues in the business. Mike, I really admire you for your love of the history of radio and for how good you were to Barry and how good Barry was to all of us through your venue. What are some of your thoughts about having worked with Barry?
Thank you, Michael. And, Barry was our colleague. He was a mentor. He was a friend. We had him here at CRN for about 12 years. And you mentioned Sean Hannity. I want to thank Sean Hannity, because on behalf of all CRN listeners, it was Sean Hannity that gave me the idea to bring the great Farber on board CRN. Sean didn't call me. I don't think he really likes me. I'm just kidding. Sean didn't call me. Actually, I was listening to Sean's show, and he had Barry fill in for him one day. And I'm listening to this, and I thought, you know, Barry, he's the greatest. He took a vacation day. Sean did. Barry filled in, and there was that radio magic of Barry Farber. It's classy, fun, always knowledgeable, and of course opinionated. He joined us about 2008. The rest was really magic. Every night, Barry brought common sense and quality and programming and curiosity and excitement. He was the wordsmith that we all know. We honored Barry in New York on his 50th anniversary in talk radio. Many of you were there at the Radio Museum in New York City. And everyone was there, from the showmanship of Steve Madden, who I think just got out of prison, to the fabulous Alan Colmes was there that night. And I don't know if Barry ever got a pair of shoes from Steve, but I know that Barry and Alan teamed up for one special time on a radio broadcast that evening. That Southern wit and that charm and that New York edge and the curiosity that was always there, as some of you have mentioned here, was always present on every Barry Farber broadcast. So, later, you know, I went to New York again on a Christmas holiday visit. I was there in New York with my daughter, Jennifer. She was invited to crash a WABC Christmas party of ex-WABC employees. And I told Jennifer, I can't go. I never worked at WABC. I'm not going to embarrass myself. But then later I called CRN to check in, and I found out that Barry Farber had called in sick for the program that night. So I told Jennifer, I said, call Frank Morano. Thank you, Frank, for the invite, by the way, and let's go. So could Barry, I was wondering, could he be at the Christmas party at WABC? So the WABC Christmas party, it was for ex-staffers, as you can imagine, packed. I'm telling you, to the walls, all the ex-staffers there. And there he was, no sniffles, no fever, just the great Barry Farber smile, the twinkle in his eye, the best stories you're ever going to hear. And I think he was auditioning for Phil Boystill before we left. It was just great fun. And there are a lot of ways that we remember Barry. And, you know, we heard him every day on the air here at CRN. And Barry was an incredible husband, an incredible dad, a great friend. He was smart, humorous. He was cagey, entertaining, always prepared. We honored Barry one more time in 2014, a lot of you remember, on his induction to the Radio Hall of Fame. And at that ceremony, Barry said he saw a lot during his 60 years in radio. He said he saw a lot of changes he had witnessed. Let's see if we can hear from Barry himself.
My first broadcast on my own show was September the 18th, 1960. And you know, in those days, you actually had to go to the radio station to be on the air. Technology arrived. Now, I wake up from a nap, throw on a bathrobe, go into the other room, push a button, and next thing you know, I'm on the air. 5 times this year, I dreamed I was on the air and woke up and found out it was true.
That's our Barry. Barry, I love you. Barry will always be in our memories. He'll be in mine. You know, Barry always had a promo that he ran on CRN. And the promo, I think the line was, the best show in the world is 2 scorpions in a brandy glass. No, Barry, the best show in the world was yours. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Mike. What a beautiful presentation. And thank you for everything that you've done for radio and continue to do. You know, it's funny you mentioned Barry Farber sayings about, you know, you have to go to the station to be on the air. I remember he made a speech at one of our talkers conventions in which he said, I was big in the old days and old in the big days. And he wasn't that old, and he certainly was big in all of the days, but it's certainly very clever wordsmithing, as you put it. Now, Frank Morano, who's our next speaker, is one of the rarest entities in radio, a local overnight talk show host. And I got to tell you, Frank, watching your career develop over the years from your days as a producer and a young broadcaster who always had respect for the older guys, and now you're becoming one of the older guys, and you're creating your own legacy. The thing I love about what you're doing at WABC on the other side of midnight is that you have all of the great tenets of the golden age of radio, the age of Barry Farber, and all of the sensibilities and knowledge of the modern era going forward. So you're the whole package. And I think, remember I said it here, I think there are really big things ahead for you, and hope for the future of talk radio with guys like you on the air at WABC. Frank, you're a big fan of Barry's career. Talk about it.
Michael, first of all, thank you. You humbled me with your praise, and I've been a fan of Talkers Magazine for many years, and you were kind enough going back 25, 30 years to answer my emails and whatever came before emails when I was seeking guidance and advice on how to make something of a career in talk radio. And I'll never forget what a big advocate you were and how generous you were with my advice. But before I was on the radio, and I'm honored to be doing a live and local show at what I consider to be the best radio station in America, I was a fan of radio. And that is one of the three primary relationships that I had with Barry over the years. The longest one is me as a fan of his. I've been a fan of Barry's work his whole life. And I got to tell you, as a fan, there was nothing like it. The way that he would give an introduction to a guest was like nobody ever before or since. He was incredible at the art of the introduction. The way that he would do a tease, his level of knowledge about seemingly every subject under the sun, his use of language. I would think he would be inventing words only to dust off my dictionary and find that no, those were actually words. But the way that he would combine words and phrases, and I'd be unable to tell if that was something that he just made up in a Shakespearean or Winchillian manner, or if that was a colloquialism from North Carolina, was simply a work of art. And there's not a lot of people on the radio that you can call artists. And that leads me to the second way in which I've had a relationship with Barry over the years. And that is largely to thank him and owe him my profession and my job, because he, for so many years, proved on the radio that a local radio show, even overnight, even late at night, could be viable. It could be commercially viable for a radio station. It could be great fun for the host, and it could attract an audience. And you can still do it while having a triple-digit IQ. I guarantee you, without Barry Farber, there's no way that I'd be doing a live and local radio show in New York City. And then that leads me to the most meaningful manner in which I got to know Barry, and that's over the course of the last 25 years or so. And that was as a friend. And they say you should never meet your heroes, and I think that's generally probably pretty good advice, because they can only disappoint you. And I was certainly prepared to meet the man and have him fall well short of my expectations. Well, imagine my surprise with every interaction that we would have, that he would far exceed all of my expectations. And he's probably the only person I've ever known in radio that's just as impressive off air as he is on. My sympathies and my condolences to Jerry, to Celia, to BB, to Jeremy, to Justin, to Joshua, to all of it, to Sarah certainly, and his entire family. But the last thing I'll mention is that I think Barry would have enjoyed the festivities today a great deal, because if there's one thing that Barry was, more so than being a radio talk show host, more so than being an author, more so than being a linguist, more so than being a political candidate who ran against legends like Mario Cuomo, Ed Koch, and Bel Abza, was the fact that he was somebody that enjoyed a good belly laugh and a good practical joke. And one quick anecdote that I want to share from you that today reminds me a bit of happened in 1959, and he relates the tale in his book, Cocktails with Molotov. Fidel Castro was coming to New York, and it was Barry's job, while working for a rock and roll station, to cover this speech and translate it from Spanish into English. Now, he, along with another couple of friends of his, met some young ladies, and it was a hot summer night, and they chose to, instead of going down to where Castro was speaking, drink some beer on the roof of his Upper East Side apartment. So, as Barry said, The night was unusually hot. The breeze on my terrace was unusually cool, and the beer was unusually welcome. And the girls didn't drink much, so we three men had more than enough. And after enjoying the opposite of working for an extended time, the news director asked me, "Did you feed all of that Castro speech you recorded?" I had not. I had a good 5 minutes left over from the day before. As casually as if he were suggesting one more beer, the news director said, "Look, right here is the place to be right now. Manhattan Center will be hot and crowded. Why don't we just call the station in about 20 minutes and pretend we're coming live from Castro's speech at the Manhattan Center?" I'd have a hard time telling a jury why I thought that was a great idea, but I did. It wasn't just the comfort of it all. The feeling of putting one over on the whole world was delicious. And so there was the news director intoning into my home telephone on the corner of West End and 79th, "Here we are, your WINS news team, live at the Manhattan Center where Fidel Castro is making his second speech of the evening. We turn now to our WINS interpreter, Barry Farber, who's translating Castro's speech simultaneously into English." And sitting here in my apartment a good 5 miles away from Manhattan Center, we played the remainder of what I had taped of Castro earlier in Central Park. The next morning, when we got to the station, we learned that Fidel Castro never made it to the Manhattan Center. There had been a bomb threat and his appearance was canceled. But the real punchline is this: we never heard a single word about this grossest of all violations of broadcast law and journalistic ethics. Despite full court coverage on the most listened to radio station in New York City, we did not get one single question or protest from the FCC. So given that that was Barry's standard, I think he would have enjoyed the pre-show Zoom hijinks more than any of them.
You've made us all feel a lot better. Thank you, Frank. Great story and a great Barry Farber impression as well.
Thank you for all for letting me be a part of it, Celia and BB especially.
Now let's keep this moving at a fast clip so that we can stay relatively within the bounds of time. The next speaker is a friend of Barry, a very good friend of Barry, and Josh, turn your mic on so that you can jump right in. He's a talk show host. He's an investigative journalist, a news anchor, a speaker, a media personality, and he's the host of Josh Bernstein Uncensored.com. Josh Bernstein.
Thank you so much for allowing me to be part of this as well. Barry was very special to me. You know, my father passed in 2019, and I grew up in New Jersey. I'm a New Jersey kid. And so I was flying back to New Jersey for the funeral, but also, you know, I had a lot of friends in New Jersey that, hey, what are you going to be doing? Are you going to have enough time to hang out and this and that? Long story short, the only person that I wanted to see, other than, of course, you know, dealing with my father and the funeral, was Barry Farber. And he was that special to me that we ended up taking the train into New York City, into around 42nd Street. And from there, we went up to his place there, got to meet the family members, of course, Sarah and Bibi and Celia and a few others. And it was just phenomenal. We got to spend, I brought my son, Jacob, who's a drummer, a very good musician. And it was just phenomenal. I had my girlfriend with us as well. And we just had a really, really nice time. I got a chance to sit with him, got a chance to talk with him. And, you know, I've done over 3,000 radio interviews in my career. And I would drop anything and everything to do Barry Farber's show, because as much as we all love to talk as talk radio, talk show hosts and all that, the best part about Barry was to just sit there and be quiet, just sink in, let it sink in and learn, because this was a man who not only seen history, but lived through it. And all of his stories were so compelling, so incredible. And what I really loved about it is that he could be talking with me about something that's happening now, present day, but he had a way of slithering that story and relating it to something in history and talking about something in history and kind of going off on a tangent. And you didn't understand 100% where it was going, but you just listened intently because you knew where it was going to end up. And eventually it would come back around and he would take that historical moment and he would bring it back to present day. And he had a way of doing that just put your jaw on the ground. It was such an incredible thing to watch and to see him do it. And one of the most incredible things and favorite things that he would say is, I did his show, I don't know, I think 300 times, possibly more. And I remember, you know, I would make a point and I would do the point and then he would say, Josh, have your secretary type it up and I'll sign it. And I used to just love that reply because it was so, no one ever said that. No one ever did that. And it was that old school mentality of the respect for radio, but also me being able to learn from a legend. And it was so a warm feeling. Anytime I could do that hour with him, it was just phenomenal. And of course, you know, I did a tribute to him after he passed. Hopefully, you know, maybe some folks get a chance to see it. Maybe it'll be part of this. But to be continued. I mean, this was his trademark. You know, of course, keep asking questions, but it was always to be continued. And I'll never forget. I believe I did the show maybe about 7 or 8 days before he passed, and he said to be continued, and I said the same thing. And it's just he was such an incredible human being, a patriot. He loved the country, and the thing that I got from him the most was the ability to learn, not just about radio and cadence and, you know, techniques and rejoiners and all of those wonderful things, but it was the history of the United States and hearing it from someone that lived through it. I'll never forget it. And God bless his soul.
Thank you, Josh. Beautifully presented. We really appreciate it. Our next speaker is somebody that worked his way up from production assistant to executive producer for Barry from 1965 to 1974. Steve was Barry's substitute host on the overnight show at WOR, and Barry took a leave of absence to run for office in 1970. And he's a dear friend of Barry and of all of us. Steve, turn your microphone on. And this, ladies and gentlemen, will be, as soon as he finds his, you waited all night and you didn't have your microphone.
Okay, I was going to say, I think I need Herb to help me. Okay.
No, you're on now. You're fine. You're good. And it was really nice hearing from you. Moving on now. No, just kidding. Go ahead, Steve. Steve Valensky, folks.
You know, working for Barry as his jack of all trades producer from 65 to 74 also included being drawn into the vortex of Barry's world. Joining Barry and his family for weekend trips wasn't unusual. Covering a few of his classes, teaching at St. John's, was sometimes expected of me. He'd even sometimes ask me to take his parents to lunch when they were visiting in New York. In 71, when he sent me to Europe to transmit daily reports for the overnight program, he asked me to stop by the hotel in Paris, where he stayed a few weeks earlier, to see if they found a necktie he inadvertently left in his room. You know, in all, working for Barry wasn't a job. It wasn't a vocation. It wasn't a career. It was a total lifestyle and the most wondrous learning experience. You know, to see and hear Barry in action every day, it was electrifying. The studio clock slithered toward the start of the program. Barry sat up in his seat at the broadcast table. The engineer flicked a switch, pointed to Barry. Simultaneously, Barry put his vocal cords in gear, encouraged some adrenaline to go splashing into his bloodstream. That's a Barryism. And voila, out flowed sheer poetry. The program started. Barry's questions were adorned with word paintings, drawing in the listeners, captivating the guests. Guests were occasionally caught off guard and gently submitted to questions they originally had no intention of answering. By 1968, Barry interviewed 10 people a week in 45-minute segments and also hosted the overnight panel discussion 5 times a week with 4 or 5 guests at a time. On the overnight segment, he resplendently conducted those panels. He had the flair of Bernstein, the energy of Fiedler, and the finesse of Toscanini. Barry had the superb natural facility to talk with anyone about anything at any time. In those days, Barry prepared professionally for every interview. He was always respectful of his guests, never angry, never insulting. He did his homework, but he let the questions speak volumes. Barry Farber loved his listeners, no matter where they encamped on the political spectrum. He respected their intelligence. Before each interview, he did his homework and prepared questions with the diligence of a student expecting to be valedictorian and appointed full professor at the same time. Astoundingly, Barry usually had all the information he needed in his head. His memory of people, places, and events was encyclopedic. He interviewed scientists, artists, writers, historians, musicians, and made them all feel as though he was gloriously knowledgeable in their area of expertise. In those days, Barry was a journalist. He practiced good journalism. He had no political agenda on the air in those days. He didn't subscribe to daily talking points sent by email. You know, there's so much more I'd love to share about Barry, but if I go on too long, Michael, you're going to get that hook and cut to the next speaker. So let me just wrap up this segment by saying that working for Barry was the greatest learning experience I ever had, far more than college, far more than graduate school. And what's very special for me is that my wife, Therese, and I met at the Barry Farber Show 50 years ago. And in Barry's honor, again, let's all remember he enriched and energized the airwaves, and for many years used that closing tagline. Let's not forget it. Keep asking questions. Thank you, Barry.
And thank you, Steve Valensky. Very nicely put.
Hi, everybody. This is Celia Farber speaking. The next person you will hear from enjoyed a friendship with Barry that lasted an astonishing 65 years. Their friendship was, for me, like a mountain at the center of our lives, the one thing that I knew I could count on that would never break down. He's like a second father to me, and next to my father's voice, his voice is the closest to my heart, my favorite sound. Barry spoke many words, millions, maybe billions. This man, Zhang Yihong, is a man of few words, yet his every word is there because he means it. He's kept quiet for many decades, but today, thanks to the loving effort of his daughter and our friend and sister, Ulla Patricia Zhang, we get to hear from him now about how he met Barry, which happens to be a nearly untold, extraordinary and rare Cold War true story. Please welcome Zhang Yihong.
My name is Zhang Yihong. I was born 1932, Chuul, North Hamgyong Province, North Korea. First time I met Barry in Vienna, Austria. We were celebrating Christmas Eve, 1956. And that time Barry was a young reporter from Greensboro, North Carolina Daily News, and I was Hungarian student refugee. And Barry was very helpful bringing me to USA, and I'm so grateful. Without Barry's help, it's impossible to come to America. When I arrived, after 1 year, I arrived in New York. Barry greeted me at the airport in Hungarian, perfect Hungarian, saying, "Mogat, Eastern host Mogat, America," which means God brought you America. And at that point, he took me to Manhattan Irish bar, and we're drinking beer, and a strange sports game on the screen. That's the American football game. And he explained to me rule of game, how to play. And that's the time on, we watched together every Thanksgiving college football game over half century. Together, we never missed. And I truly miss him watching with him college football game.
Okay, our next guest speaker is Stu Tarlow, who, listening to Barry on the radio in the 60s and even at their first meeting in 78, Stu had no idea that he and Barry would meet again in 2004, become friends, and that Stu would be Barry's personal proofreader and editor, and even spend a week as Barry and Sarah's house guest at the Apthorpe. But that's exactly what happened. And I see your microphone is turned on. So here, ladies and gentlemen, is Stu Tarlow. Stu, take it away.
Hi, everybody. I'm honored to be part of this. You know, the highlight of being Barry and Sarah's house guest, I'd like to add, was that all the time I listened to Barry as a teenager, I loved the way he introduced his guests as my partner for the expedition. And during the week that I spent with Barry and Sarah in their apartment, I was Barry's partner for the expedition on every show that he did that week. And that might be one of the great highlights of my life. Barry has always been on the top rung of my personal pantheon of heroes and role models. And as Frank Morano noted, when one is privileged to actually meet and get to know one's heroes, it can be fraught with peril because so many idols turn out to have feet of clay. And such is not the case of Barry Farber. In person and in private, Barry was every bit the epitome of a Southern gentleman that he came across as on the radio and in his writing. If you were to ask Barry what he thought about some utterly reprehensible paskudniak, rather than say, oh, that blankety blanking so-and-so, Barry would follow the Southern tradition of just saying, bless his heart. But there was one time when Barry said something that may have just tiptoed to the edge of genteel decorum. And it was in 2016 or so. And we were discussing a politician who we need not identify here, who had been touting himself as an expert on, among other things, Bosnia. Now, remember, Bosnia is only one of the many places throughout the world about which Barry could not only say he'd been there and done that, but could also add that he spoke the language. And Barry's reaction to this politician's claim of expertise about Bosnia was as follows. And engineer, you might want to cue up the rim shot for this. Barry said, really? I've been more places in Bosnia naked than that fellow has been with his clothes on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stu. That's Stu Tarlow, folks. The next speaker is Russell Harvey. He's an artist, writer, and performer. In 1990, he interviewed Barry Farber on Russell Harvey Almost Live, which is a Westchester County cable television show that he hosted and produced, and it was the beginning of a long and beautiful friendship. Russell, it's your turn.
Very nice to meet you. I think, Barry, if you were here, he would notice in the background not just BB and Celia, but all of the beautiful Farber women that are in this program. And I think that he would give them all a compliment for that. But I want to say I'm here from Miami Beach, which Barry told me more than once since I moved here. It was his favorite spot in the world. And after first coming here in 1936, and that his grandfather and uncle both owned hotels here in Miami Beach. Very few people attain what Barry Farber did. I don't know if people can. Barry, when I drove him up to interview him, he said, "Can I stop for a cup of coffee?" So we stopped at this little bagel place, and 5 minutes later comes out with his coffee and a huge sack full of bagels. And I said, "That's your breakfast?" He said, "Well, they recognize my voice, and I'm a semi-celebrity, so they gave me these bagels when I told them I was doing this television program." But I don't think he was a semi-celebrity. I think he was a legitimate local celebrity in New York. I don't know if we have those anymore. I don't think the media landscape is such that has it. So he had this tremendous accomplishment, and yet he was kind, I hear from some of the other people, to all of us who are working our way up. And over the last 15, 20 years, we exchanged emails, and he just would not say that was a nice thought that you had. It was the greatest thought. I could see wonderful things happening, superlative. I don't think that he could just leave without a tremendous compliment to the person that he was talking to. And he was just a genuinely nice man.
Thank you, Russell. And a great story about mentioning he was famous in New York. When Barry Farber was in the heyday of his career, being famous in New York was about as big as you could get in radio. And he achieved that. So,
and I also think he said when he did the overnight program, which I became familiar with him in the late 70s and early 80s, that the New York overnight audience is bigger than any audience in any other city during the daytime, pretty much.
Yeah, it's pretty big stuff. It's big time radio, and he was on the big time stations.
And that's why he's in the Hall of Fame.
Thank you very much, Russell. Appreciate it.
My pleasure and my honor.
Okay, we're going to go on to Charles Wiley now. Charles is with us, I assume. And Charles Wiley is a World War II veteran, as you can tell. And he's a journalist and a lecturer. And from the 1960s until Barry's passing, Charles was a very close personal friend and a guest on many hundreds of Barry's shows. The microphone is yours now.
Well, I thought I'd give you two quick stories that I think kind of sum up Barry. One's very, very personal. When my 19-year-old son drowned in an accident, friends came from all sides to comfort and help. And when I said that I was going to give the eulogy, nearly everyone was against it. They were afraid that I might collapse while doing it. And plan B was to have someone standing by to finish if I couldn't. An awesome task. And Barry was called. And he had a perfect excuse to avoid taking on that terrible job. But he didn't. And by the way, his excuse was that he had a program on at the exact same time as the funeral. And instead of just using that and saying, gee, I don't want to get into that, he arranged with another great talk show guy, Bruce Williams. He arranged with Bruce to take over his show so that he could come to the funeral. And he looked over my notes for the eulogy, and he stood by my side while I gave it. And that's the kind of guy Barry Farber is. He comes through for his friends. I don't know very many people in my life that ever came through as much as he did. And I also always look at Barry and his priceless lines, his one-liners and ad-libs. And my favorite is one night I handed him a note while we were on the air saying that I might have to leave early because I had to get the last bus home and to New Jersey. And he read it to himself. And then while we were on the air, he told his audience, he said, where did I go wrong? He said, Johnny Carson has guests that leave early to fly to the West Coast. And I got some guy that needs to get the last bus to Sayreville, New Jersey. God bless you, Barry, my old friend. I miss you so much.
Charles, thank you so much. Very nicely put and very appreciated. Clifford D. May is the president of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, which is a Washington-based think tank focusing on national security. A former New York Times foreign correspondent, currently writes a weekly column for the Washington Times and hosts a podcast called Foreign Policy. Let's hear now from Cliff. Thank you, Cliff.
Under 3 minutes, I'm going to tell you a little story about how I met Barry and how it changed my life. The year was 1975. I had just gotten out of Columbia Journalism School. I had a master's thesis I had done there, which I happily sold to the Atlantic Monthly. It was then, and it is now, a major publication. It was a very fun piece to report and to write. The headline of it was "Private, Whatever Became of Sam Spade, the Private Eye in Life and Literature." All I did for this piece was I spent months going to bars, drinking with private detectives, and reading Dashiell Hammett and Raymond Chandler books, and then wrote this piece that became the cover story for The Atlantic on the private eye in fact and fiction. I'd never been on radio before. I was 24 years old. I managed to get a job as a reporter on a New Jersey newspaper. I get a call from Barry's producer. Really like your cover story in the Atlantic Monthly. Come on the show. So I go to the studio. I've never been on. I'm very nervous. I sit down in front of the microphone. Barry gives me a very nice introduction. Says, "Oh, Cliff May wrote this really interesting piece about private eyes, the real life private eyes, fictional detectives. Want to hear from him?" And then he kind of hit the cough button, leaned forward and said, "I just got to go to the bathroom. Just talk for a little while, would you please?" And walked out of the room. I was as scared as I could be, but I managed to talk. I did fine. I had no idea. It was like a kind of baptism of fire. He came back in, sat down, gave me a signal to wrap up, asked me some more questions, and we had a very good interview. It was fine. In fact, he enjoyed it. I enjoyed it, and he began to invite me back, kind of like sometimes as a sidekick. If he had a guest on that he didn't know a lot about, he figured I'd do some research. One time he had on either the foreign minister or the minister of tourism from the Gambia in Africa and said, "Cliff, you come on to help me ask some questions." So I did some research. I came on the show. We had the guy from the Gambia. At one point, he said, "You all have to see the Gambia, so I'm going to invite you to come." And Barry said, "Sure, I'm happy to do that." I said, "I'd love to do that." I'd never been to Africa, of course, in my life. Barry didn't go, but I did get invited on a reporting trip led by Alex Haley, the author of Roots. And that was my first trip to Africa. And I got quite interested, and I ended up a few years later as the New York Times foreign correspondent and bureau chief in Africa. So totally changed my life going on that show and knowing Barry, and I enjoyed every show I ever did with him. I always learned, always had a good time. He was always more than and nice to me and helped me as a young reporter.
Thank you, Cliff. Very, very nicely put. We appreciate it very much. We're at the end of the program, and I just want to make sure, is Erwin Goldman here?
Erwin Goldman, a friend that Barry has had since 1936.
From Erwin Goldman in Greensboro, North Carolina, a special friend of Barry's. Where I come from, a person only has a few special friends. Barry was one of my very few special friends. We bonded in Temple Emmanuel in Greensboro, North Carolina in Sunday school in 1936 and stayed bonded through our whole lives. Through school, then college, same fraternity, we were always close. We really got close when we went to the 1952 Olympics in Helsinki and stayed with an exchange student's parents in Helsinki. We traveled all over Europe, made good friends, and it was a very, very wonderful visit. That way, Barry could always add to his language repertoire. You know, Barry spoke 16 languages, including 3 dialects of Chinese. When Sandy and my wife and I visited Barry in New York at the Apthorpe, he would always say, "Which dialect in Chinese do you want to eat at tonight?" Barry always amazed me with his quick wit and intellect, but his goodness, kindness, and big heart were always there. I remember the Barry stories that keep flooding back. There are so many. He'll never forget his Jewish Southern roots. He loved Israel, sold a lot of Israeli bonds. Barry could speak with authority on almost any subject from current news events to Southern barbecue, which he loved. I think as a radio and TV interviewer, he had few peers. What a vocabulary. How about "'twas the night before Christmas" in Yiddish? It seems strange I'm telling you about Barry today. He was always bigger than life. I miss you, pal. Oh, for crying out loud.
Okay, thank you very much. And that was one of the clips that we were able to get across. That was Erwin Goldman, who is a lifelong friend of Barry. They met when they were 6 years old. at the Temple Emmanuel Sunday School in Greensboro, North Carolina, and they went as buddies together all the way through college. We're going to play in closing now a video production that was put together by Celia Farber in memory of her father. It was supposed to open the program. It's going to close the program. And then afterwards, anybody that wants to talk to BB, they can. The talkers part of the program will end at the end of this clip, at which point I will sign off for talkers, and you can talk amongst yourselves after that. So here now is a clip that was a video that was put together in honor of the man that we've gathered tonight to pay tribute to, and that is Barry Farber.
To the flag of the United States of America, America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, one nation under God, with liberty and justice for all, with liberty and whatever it is, and justice for all. So what he did was simply compound phrases to make it fit. And the congressman loved it, and the nation loved it, and that was
Thank you, sir. Number 3, what is your real name and what do you do?
My name is Barry Farber, and I do a local interview program on WOR.
Of the other guy's language turns ice immediately into steam. When I learned that the Norwegian word for squirrel was acorn. Maybe that doesn't do it for you, but it did it for me. And then
when a tightrope walker gets right out there in the middle and starts standing on his head, what percentage of the crowd in the circus secretly hopes he'll fall?
I would say about 1%.
Barry Farber, and I was just explaining. I would imagine that's the way the Norwegian underground women ran through downtown Bergen when they got news of the Nazi surrenders.
Put me on the hog train. That's too good, Adrian.
mikor ide jöttem, volt most useless language I knew.
So funny because it has nothing to do with the original. It starts out spur doing cowboy natties, and right away it's ridiculous. Ask any cowboy down in Tennessee. In Norway, they think Tennessee's some wild western. They don't realize it's Eastern establishment. Gå ut efter öl som skulle gå ut efter öl efter hoppsasa tralalala som skulle gå ut efter öl. Till korna kom det en ung student mens mannen var ut efter öl. Mens mannen var ut efter öl.
I'm very glad we had a chance to see that, and that will be at barryfarberradio.com.
Hello, everybody. This is Celia Farber, Barry's younger daughter. I made the film you just saw. On the night that we broadcast this memorial, we had some rather hilarious technical difficulties, so we have pieced a few things together after the fact. I want to thank my sister Bibi, who did such a remarkable job with all of this, and Michael Harrison of Talkers Magazine, all of our speakers, and all the people who are listening in. We all love him so much and miss him so much. I always get the question, what was it like growing up with the great radio legend Barry Farber as my father? Well, a little bit of historical context. We didn't really grow up with Barry. We grew up with our mother, primarily in Sweden. She took us to her native Sweden when we were 11 and 13, and we lived there consistently for 8 years. Never came back to the States during that time. And Barry and Ulla split up in New York when we were 3 and 5. There were times when I struggled with how much of him went to his radio family, his radio life. But I came to terms with it. And the way I came to terms with it was I realized that that was what God made him for. And it really actually was essential that his soul, his time, his attention went to that, not to teaching me how to ride a bike. I got over it. I got his fathering in so many other ways that were not conventional, but were so extraordinary. Sometimes I've been thinking one of the ways we can light up our parents the best is by recalling their rebukes or corrections, and there weren't very many from my father, but there was one that made such an impact on me. I was 8 years old, and we were in the back of a car, and like every 8-year-old, I was a big Beatles fan, so I was pestering him to tell me once again the story of how John Lennon was a fan of his. And he turned around and he looked at me, and he said, "Celia, don't be impressed by celebrity." And I sort of recoiled like a little snail in the back seat, and I felt such shame, but it was important shame. And he was absolutely right, and that was such an important lesson. Another one was, it's very short. I asked him about journalism and what do I need to know, and he said, I can sum it up in 3 simple words. I think you all know the 3 words: penetrate the ostensible. His mind was just constantly casting off totally original gems like that. He was wise, he was hilarious, he was kind, he was generous. He was in many ways impossible, but always hilariously so. He was my daddy, he was my hero, he was my mountain. But it helps me to know that all of you are out there and we're all missing him together and remembering him together and repeating his endless Barryisms together. He loved you all so much, and he knew that you loved him. Daddy, thank you for everything. I love you.
I'm Michael Harrison, publisher of Talkers. I want to thank the Farber family. I want to thank Bibi and Celia for having me join in as a moderator. For those watching on YouTube, we apologize for some of the technical problems we had, but the good spirit that came out of it, and I hope Bibi and Celia feel a lot more relieved now, that because going through that is always very difficult, but it was done with such good cheer and camaraderie, and a lot of folks still here. I just want to thank everybody for being great participants and for everybody watching. I've been getting a lot of texts from people saying that they've been watching it on YouTube and that it actually was a wonderful program. So I feel real good about it. And I want to thank everybody that participated. Celia, thank you. And Bibi, thank you. Bibi, I'm going to turn it over to you, and you can wrap it up in any way that you see fit. I'm going to step into the background now, and I wish everybody well. And check out BarryFarberRadio.com.
Great job, Mike.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Michael, so much. Well, if everyone, Patty and Justin, our hosts, technically speaking, can hang on for a few more minutes, I'd like to let the people on our Zoom call say a few words. And I thought that was a breathtaking tribute, Celia. Thank you. It was beautiful, and I'm glad we did it at the end. Most of the people who logged on are still with us, and we will edit this whole program into something no one will ever know what we went through. Okay, I'm going to put on my glasses and see who would like to speak, who has not had a chance to say a few words. And thank you.
That way from me.
Yeah, Lori. Okay, I would just want to say, Lori has been a radio producer. Her husband, Herb, has been a radio engineer and producer, and I believe on air also. They just sent me a very...
What do we have for dinner?
They just sent me a wonderful 3-hour Barry Farber show that I edited the other day. And so Herb Squire was a WOR engineer back in the 60s. And really, he worked for... Gene Shepard. Are you there? You there, Lori? Okay, Lori. I want to say something. Let them take over. Okay, great. So Herb Squire, thank you, was one of Barry's engineers back in the 60s, and he just sent me WAV files that I turned into a video. And it was a wonderful show about 2 engineers who were retiring, and they had been sound effects men. They'd been with WOR most of their careers. They had been sound effects men starting in the 30s and 40s, and Barry interviewed them. And I have so many striking memories, impressions from that show, which you can see on BarryFarberRadio.com or listen to. But one of the things was, Barry said, is it true radio was more glamorous back in those days, the 30s and 40s? Is it true the talent dressed up in tuxedos to go into the studio? And the answer from these gentlemen was, not only the talent wore tuxedos, the sound effects men wore tuxedos in the 30s and 40s. So that's the audio this man, Herb Squire, sent me the other day. I turned it into a YouTube video. Welcome, Herb. And Lori.
Oh, thank you.
Only here I could contribute on several things. The sight of Barry leading a conga line at our twin daughter's Banat Mitzvah was wonderful. And he was our matchmaker. I was a Barry Farber listener when I was a teenager. I even studied Serbo-Croatian because I had heard that was his favorite language. And when I was 16, my father was in advertising and was able to get me for my 16th birthday up to watch a Farber show being taped. I was thrilled. I paid no attention to anybody else that was in what I learned was the control room. And that was January of 19, whatever. Go ahead, 5 more years. And my first job out of college was WOR. And I eventually met this man who, engineer. We became boyfriend, girlfriend. And then one night I was going through pictures and I was saying, I wore this outfit the night I actually watched Barry tape a show. And he interrupted me to start describing the outfit that I was wearing. He was the engineer. I didn't know it. He was the engineer. So 5 years after meeting him, 6 years after meeting him, we got married.
Congratulations.
That's my contribution. And Barry was a friend for years.
Thank you. Thank you. And Herb, you were so great to contribute this audio. And you've been an engineer and been part of radio history. I really want to thank you.
Well, I'm going to work on some more audio that I still have. I haven't changed the analog to digital yet.
Thank you. Okay, we'll work together. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Love to have you here. Love to be connected to you, and to Bob Skidmore and Steve Valensky, all the WOR folk from the heyday. Thank you so much. Anybody else? Anybody else who would like to raise their hand, as Barry would say, during these
Ted is there.
Ted Kavanaugh. Okay, thank you. I'm going to find Ted here on my... Ted Kavanaugh. There he is, Ted Kavanaugh, old friend of Barry's and Sarah's. And Sarah always said, Ted, he won't tell you he wants to speak, but he will speak tonight. So welcome, Ted. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. In fact, I was probably the one that brought Barry and Sarah together.
In fact, you were. You were.
Yes, I have a list that I've run for about 30 years of stories I send out. And Barry was on the list, and Sarah was on the list. And Barry said to me, "Is that Sarah from Channel 5? I've always had a crush on her." I said, "Yes." And that's how Sarah and Barry got together.
That's a true story, everybody. Absolutely 100% true.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ted.
My favorite story about Barry is that Margaret and I were in Europe. We went to this French, it was a castle actually, and a castle in which the whole town lived in the castle in the old days. And now there was a restaurant and tourist stores there. So we went to the restaurant, and there were these long tables with a lot of people sitting at it. And in the table we were sitting at, there was a group of people from the Nordic countries. There must have been about 6 or 8 of them. And they were, of course, everyone spoke English. And I always like to brag about Barry. So I said to them, I got a friend that speaks an awful lot of languages, and I'm sure he can speak yours too. They didn't believe it. So I had one of the early cell phones, and I called Barry from France, and Barry got on the phone. And I said, "Barry, I'm going to turn you over to these people, and you speak to each one of them in their different Nordic languages, and because I don't believe it's possible." And they did. And of course, Barry did. So that was really an amazing event that I'd never forgotten. So I was often on Barry's show. I love Barry. And nowadays, in the troubled times we have, he's a voice that I wish was still there. We need him so badly. Yeah. And I certainly miss him and think about it every day and still brag about him and the language he's spoken, and just love the guy.
Thank you, Ted. I agree with you. And as his daughter, I find that when I hear his voice and I'm working on these this audio, I feel much more comforted and I feel happy and like he's there. Oh, there he is. Like, where'd he go? Oh, there he is. He's in these words, and you can go to the website and find, or you can go to CRN, or you can go to our website, Barry Farber Radio, which links to CRN. You can listen to every podcast from the last 12 years or more and hear his voice. I find it very comforting always and enlightening, and I always end up laughing more than crying. Thank you for your contribution. Thank you for getting Sarah and Barry together.
You're welcome.
Would anyone else like to say a few words?
BB?
Yes.
Well, Ted, if Ted is taking credit for getting Barry and Sarah together, it really should be pointed out that they didn't get married until 40 years later.
I know,
and
but Barry did say, Barry said, is that the Sarah Pence that I remember from WNEW News Channel 5? And Ted said they were on the same blog, they were on the same mailing list, and it was Ted Kavanaugh's mailing list.
But they both love to tell the story about how when they first met, they got together, and this is also a classic Farberism, they got along like a slow waiter and a bad tipper.
That's right. That's
So
right.
Fortunately, they got past that, but it took 40 years.
Yeah. That's right. In the beginning, it didn't work out, but it worked out subsequently. And Celia.
Yeah. Well, many people have pointed out about Barry's poetry, and it was there always, the way he chose how to say something, how to say a thing, whether it was email or so. We were at the emergency room for a good 11 hours, and he didn't want to eat anything, but I finally said, let me get you a little something, and I came back with a croissant and some fresh orange juice, and he drank some of the orange juice and he ate the croissant, but he was really not well, and he couldn't speak a word for all of those hours. And I said, Daddy, how was the croissant? And I could see it was a struggle. And he said, it was everything a great croissant should be.
Yes, yes, yes. He used to interview us on our birthdays when we were children, and he would say, well, now you're 7. How does it feel to be 7? Did you did you think about what it would be like to be 7? And does it feel the way you thought it would be? Now you're 7. You realize you're not 6 anymore. You're never going to be 6 anymore. You're 7. Yeah. He interviewed us on every birthday. So Barry, we love you. We thank you. I hope I haven't missed anyone. Raise your hand really, really violently so I see you. Otherwise, we will sign off. And thank you all so very much. You've all brought out elements that are unique, heartfelt, just so endemic to amazing Barry, who was sort of on so many levels at one time. He was childlike and wildly supernaturally intelligent and academic and unlike any other broadcaster. And I really feel, listening to a lot of talk radio myself and listening to a lot of Barry recently, he really wanted to improve his audience's mindset and elevate their souls every chance he could with every way he could. So thank you, Barry. And we love you, Daddy. And thank you, everyone, tonight. Thank you.
To be continued.
To be continued. Great job.
Questions?
Baby, you did a wonderful job, and it's a beautiful honor you paid your father.
And also, Jeremy, it's got to be like, what, 3 a.m. where you are now?
Yeah, more or less.
Go to sleep.
3:40.
To the Farber sisters, what a joy it was working with you on this, and you did a good job. And the things that went wrong really went right. Congratulations to you both, And Barry Farber was very lucky to have the two of you as daughters, and a great grandson, Jeremy. And Jerry, if you're around in there or you're sleeping, thank you. And it was a pleasure meeting those of you I don't know. And Mike, thank you out there for everything you've done, and to those who stayed to the very end. So on behalf of our end of this, Michael Harrison at Talkers, have a great night. And we're all very lucky to have known one way or the other the great Barry Farber. Good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael.